Saturday Morning Physics is sponsored by the M. Lois Tiffany Endowment, the Hideko Tomazawa Endowment, the Physics Department, and by gifts from friends of the program.
The overview of my talk is taking technologies from universities or national labs or wherever you find them that may have commercial value, but I'm going to talk about the pitfalls to the path, all the different things that happen and the things you have to do to make it work. I'm going to talk about the process of developing the high-tech products into production in small startup companies. All the examples I give today and everything I'm talking about is based on experience with little companies, just from 2 or 3 people up to maybe 20 people or so, maybe 50 after they've grown. But generally, this is a particular angle on technology development in small companies, which is very different than how it would be done in a big company. And you'll see about the flexibility and ability to quickly change your path are real critical because of the way things go and the changes you run into, and they're certainly not all technical. So the outline is I talk a little bit about how I got into this by chance, an overview of the process, and then various problems and pitfalls that occur when you go to carry this out. A few case studies, failures and successes, and then a little bit about what maybe I learned from this and what you might learn. So how did I get to this? I was a student here at U of M in physics and had a part-time job at a company where I did work on blood handling devices and blood sensors. And this was my first introduction to a small company. I really enjoyed it. It was a wide range of challenges, and I decided that that's what I wanted to do after I graduated. And then I repeated that mostly with companies in this area, and there's a lot of things going on, obviously because of the university. Radar systems and transfusion filters and so on. You can read the list there. It's been very interesting and very diverse. The most fun thing about it has been to finish with one project in one area and then pick up something very different in another. A lot of it's been biotech related, but a lot of sensing systems too, and it's been interesting. Then after being with a lot of these companies, I worked for a company called Arbor, which is a venture capital firm that does micro and nanotech commercialization, and I helped evaluate technologies for them and help the companies that they had invested in move forward into commercialization, just being kind of an advisor. And there's the third bullet point lists some of the different technologies that those companies were based on, and a lot of those were MEMS-based companies, which I'll be mentioning again a little later. MEMS is micro electromechanical systems. It's producing small devices using semiconductor fabrication capabilities, but not just making circuits, making actual devices that can be sensors or mechanical devices or actuators and so on. It's a very interesting technology, has very strong pluses and minuses. Right now, as Myron mentioned, I'm with Transloom, which is a spin-out from Center for Ultrafast Optical Sciences. And this company works with femtosecond lasers to develop a wide range of products. I'll talk more about this later. It's a little too wide, and that has to do with a story you'll see in a little bit. In any case, I found that in doing this, it's nice to, when you join with a company, to stay several years at least to contribute, so you're involved. But if you find you've been there maybe 5 years or so, you might wonder why it should be successful, or maybe you want to do something new. So I tend to kind of move on. I try to kind of stay in that time window and do different things rather than be doing the same thing for years and years. I was influenced heavily here at University of Michigan when I was a student, where I got my fundamental understanding of physics, which has been useful in biotech and sensors and ion traps and all sorts of the different things that I've had to work on. It's a great background because you get, you're not a specialist in anything, but you can always go down to the base level and understand anything that you need to at the level you want. And I was influenced by one of my favorite professors, Art Rich, who worked with, he was Dick Crane's student back, I guess probably in the 60s, who worked on various different areas of physics. And he told me he'd like to move into a new area, review the problems, make a contribution while knowing as little irrelevant information as possible. So I just really remember that, because it's, if you come into something new, you kind of can size it up better maybe than people have thought about it too long. It's not always true, but often you can come up with different ideas, and it's just been a guiding principle for me. He's a great guy. This work that I'm talking about is fundamentally different than what you usually hear about at these lectures. It's not basic science. It's not. It's a development of things that will be used in the real world. To distinguish this, I've always liked this quote. This was by the director of Fermilab when he was asked about applications. In this case, they were defense related, but it could be any, what that might come out of the work, and this is his answer. I won't bother to read it. You can see it. Very nice. I mean, that's what physics and science is all about. It's a cultural endeavor. It's not to do with practical issues, although certainly practical issues can come out of it, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the work I'm going to talk about lies somewhere between the pure science, physics or chemistry or biology, and the world of routine engineering. And by that I mean developing products using principles that are well established and well known, like developing a new model of a car, for example, where everything is pretty clear and it's just a matter of doing it. It's not new science, but it's somewhere in that middle ground where there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of challenges. But in all cases, the goal is solving some human problems and not the development of the understanding of our world. Bringing the technology to real world for practical use is always the goal. So I'll talk a little bit about what the process is. I won't spend too long on this, but give you an idea, if you haven't been involved in little companies before, what goes into making a startup and what it's like to try to move it along ultimately to the end. The technology that you focus on should be targeted at a large market. This is very important. If it's something that's idiosyncratic or a small market, that's definitely a problem, because almost certainly the amount of effort going in to develop the technology that seems to be already developed at the laboratory or university level is going to be a lot of work. And so there's a lot of risk, and the likely outcome is a lot of investment goes into the company and it's all lost. So there has to be a market large enough to make it worth taking the risk. The technology should be disruptive, is a word that's often used. Somehow different in a fundamental way, and bringing something really new to the table. And there should be some way that you can protect it, either through a patent or as a trade secret. In some cases, if you get out early, in some cases, that's what it seems Apple Computer's been able to do, bring something out that's new and they get a head start. But you have to have something that sets you aside from everybody else, or it becomes a commodity and you don't have an advantage. A real important question is, why isn't it there? And a lot of times the answer is because nobody wants it, and that's real important to find that out early on. A lot of times it's not there because they can't do it or it's very hard, but often it's because no one wants it, and that's an unpleasant thing to find after you've gone way down the road with something. You need to identify a path to market. This is often overlooked. How are you going to sell this? Are you going to have a partner? If it's something that needs support in the field, you can't just sell it over the internet. You can't sell flow cytometers over the internet to people. They need support. This is a very important part. You have to think this out. You're going to partner with somebody, and if so, how does that work? And then there's also special considerations for various markets. I'll talk a little more about this later. Regulatory issues, reimbursement for payment in clinical areas. These are in biomedical, clinical biomedical. Those are important things to think through. If a technology is developed, a new treatment of some sort for diabetes and it can't get reimbursed by Medicare or third-party payers, then that's definitely a problem. And if you're going in the automotive area, that is very tricky. You have to think how to do that. You'll need a partner almost for sure. And you need to get your company funded. This can be done with angels. Angel investors are people who've usually been through this process and then reinvest themselves. Your family, of course, yourself, whatever. You can then go to venture capital groups. That could be at first or afterwards or whatever. You need to have a clear plan for these professional investing groups as to how this is going to go and who the partners are and so forth, and how it will conclude. Or you can go to government funding, which is very wide-ranging, and they're willing to take a chance on very new technology. It is slow, though. It takes a long time to write the proposals, and the work tends to be drawn out, and unless you're very lucky, it can also sort of drag you off track. You can be moving in that general direction you want to go, but kind of get pulled off by different interests. You know, they may not exactly want to develop the thing you're targeting. Development always takes more time and resources than you expected, so you always need more money. That's certainly almost always been true. Not always. In some cases, you'll see when the market's right, it's, you don't have to do that. So this is some different areas. I'll just briefly mention these. This is sort of just background of the types of things you think about when you're thinking of either investing in a company, as would be the case with Ardesta if I was advising them, or if you're thinking of joining with a company. Research in laboratory markets, that's things used in research laboratories, like here at U of M. It's generally a small market, not usually very good, but sometimes there are very great successes, and a couple of companies here in Ann Arbor have done very well addressing that market. Biomed is a very good market, but it's tough in terms you have to go through clinical testing, regulatory, the reimbursement that I mentioned. Automotive market's very tough. Prices, obviously, I mean, it's just a real issue. You've got to really have something that's distinctly valuable. You have a good lock on it, and it's got to be inexpensive. And the path to it, it was through these so-called Tier 1 or Tier 2. These are companies that supply the automotive manufacturers, but it's really good to get the auto company interested to pull the technology through these suppliers. So it's a tricky path. Heavy equipment industry or aerospace, where there's a high capital equipment cost type of stuff. The profit margins on technologies and sensors can be high, but generally it's extremely slow time to market. So that can be a problem for a small startup that would have to then survive for a long time without any sales. And municipalities, public utilities, water and electric and so on, generally are slow moving. They have protocols in place for testing and procedures, and it's kind of hard to get them to take new technologies. There's exceptions to all of this, of course. These are just sort of general observations, but it's good to generally know what you're getting into when you look at an area or you're thinking about working on a project with somebody or joining a company. These are good considerations to have in mind. And outcomes, if a company is successful for the investors, they can license the technology or manufacture it. Those are the manufacturing, very common here in Ann Arbor. A lot of companies have just continued to manufacture, and that's sort of the end game. Acquisitions are common too, where the company's bought up by a strategic partner of some sort and then joins with a bigger company. IPOs or initial public offerings are going public. I have no experience with that. It doesn't happen so much for the little companies that have been here in Ann Arbor. Or you get an automatic outcome if the company fails, which is often the outcome that is very common. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the process. And first thought is that sometimes technology can be redeployed. MEMS accelerometers, this is the microelectromechanical systems, again. For deploying airbags on cars, you need to know when the car is decelerating, and you need to know it very reliably, obviously. And initially, these little devices were done with I think it was a ball with a spring, and then The deceleration would knock the little ball out, and they would detect that electrically. But ultimately, better systems were developed that made measurements of acceleration by analog devices and Motorola, I think, and others. There's extremely long development time and extremely expensive, and the reason was the market was enormous. Each car has many of these on them. And it was also driven by regulations. It wasn't just market driven, it was required to have these airbags. So this was a huge effort by big companies. This is not a startup effort in any manner, but it developed devices that then are available to everybody for very little money. They're extremely reliable because people's lives depend on them. They're low cost because they're going into automotive, and they have value for all sorts of things. And I've worked on several companies that have used this technology, redeployed it to make other devices. I'm just going to make a brief list here of some of the things. If you just go on the internet and look around it, it's everywhere. Smartphones, iPads, anything that you turn and the picture changes orientation is done by gravitation measurement from an accelerometer in the device. There's shoes that connect to iPhones that can tell you about impact when you're running. These gloves here on the right you might have seen, you can move your arms or hands, and all of that is tracked exactly in a computer by watching the acceleration of your fingertips. Game controllers have them. They're used to track the progress of Parkinson's disease, to watch how the shaking of a limb will change over time, and all sorts of things. So these come up all the time, and it's probably one of the very best examples of a technology that was developed in one context and then wound up being very valuable in a completely different area, or areas all over the place. I want to talk now about applications. Where do you find technologies that can be applied to different sorts of commercialization processes? Early 1970s, Arthur Ashkin, I think, at Bell Labs, worked with the photon and momentum of photons, which is Planck's constant divided by the wavelength. That's the amount of momentum each photon carries. The wavelength of the photon is divided into Planck's constant. And so each photon carries momentum. So if you bounce light off something, it physically pushes on it. Even though there's no ponderable matter in the light, it still can exert a force on what it's impinging on. And if you work out, there's a little picture there on the left of the change in momentum as you send a light beam through a dielectric sphere, a refracting sphere. You can actually find that you can grab and move particles around with small beams of light. Well, this is very interesting, and it was a kind of an oddity for a long time, and also thought to be nothing more than an oddity, but actually now it's been converted into a commercial product. In fact, there's several products involved with it. The one I wanted to mention, just to give you an idea of the process of this movement from the lab to real world, is ARIX, which is in Chicago, which make the BioRicks 200, which is a device that uses a beam of light. It goes through a holographic filter that creates many beams at once, so you can project down onto a surface a number of beams simultaneously, and by changing the shape of the hologram, you can move those beams around, and they can go down onto a surface where you might have cells or small spheres or whatever you're working with, and it can reach down, grab them, and move them around. So many particles can be simultaneously moved by many beams. So this is an example of using light to manipulate things, but in a very practical and useful way. Here's another example. It can work with cells, viruses, all sorts of different things, colloids, little droplets of liquid, and it can sort them or do anything you might want to do on a surface, but it can also stack them up and make 3D objects, so you can actually build things, small objects with it. I'll show a movie of an example of this. This is blood cells. It's diluted blood coming in from the upper left and flowing down to a T-junction. It can go either right or left. And the line you see of cells there are being stopped or held in place by a light beam. You can't see it because it's filtered out in the movie. But those are not held by any kind of matter or material. It's just light, and there it's turned off, and there they go. So that's a way to sort cells, and in this practical application, the blood cells are going down both arms. The platelets, which are smaller, and occasionally you'll see one, they're more rarefied and smaller, will go down both arms because they're the way the waist of the beam is designed and the power of the beam and so on, it's set up so that the platelets go down both arms and are not affected by the filter. So this way you can send platelets in the blood down both arms, and you do it without touching them with any ponderable matter, so they're unactivated. So if you've got a system, as this was developed for, to monitor the activity of platelets in your blood, how readily do they become activated, how well do they stick together, this is one possible way to separate them out without affecting them as you do it. And so that's based on the light momentum. Get back here. Okay. So that's Eric's. Another area of physics that is kind of strange, that you would think is just a pure science and not ever to be applied to anything, is quantum entanglement. You hear a lot about this in terms of quantum computers, which employ the technique, but basically without, there's different aspects to it, but the fundamental idea is illustrated by this. On the top picture, there's meant to be like a breakdown of a composite system, and two particles come out of that system, and one goes to the right and one goes to the left. And initially, in this example, there's no angular momentum to the composite particle, so there's no spin. It's spin zero. It's just has no angular momentum at all. And so when the particles go off like that, the one on the right carries angular momentum up. You can measure it and see that. You can put a magnetic field and make a measurement of the angular momentum along one axis. By the way the wave functions wrap around atoms, or the way wave functions work for particles, gives us something called the uncertainty principle, which has to do with the way you can form these wave functions. And it turns out you can't measure both two axes at once. In other words, if you measure the angular momentum of a particle as a z being up, then that puts it into an eigenstate or a state of the wave function such that you can't also know with perfect certainty it's x or y angular momentum. So if you have this thing happen, you take a composite system with no angular momentum, you send the particles off on either side, and then you measure, you let them go so far away from one another that there's no way they can communicate conventionally because the speed of light won't permit it, and you make a measurement so quickly on both of them that they can't talk to one another in any normal manner. And the one on the right, it measures z up, but the one on the left must be angular momentum down because of the conservation of angular momentum. But let's suppose the one on the left, you go ahead and measure that, and you measure it in an you try to force into an eigenstate of x angular momentum horizontally. So you try to, you know it's z, so now you're going to learn both z and x by making a measurement of it on the left. Well, if you try to do that, you'll find that by making the measurement over on the right, you instantaneously altered the wave function of the particle on the left, so it, having never been measured and having no reasonable way to have communicated with the particle on the right, has popped into an eigenstate of z angular momentum, and you can't measure its x angular momentum. In other words, they've talked to one another somehow, or something. It's not really. I'm not sure that anybody has an actual clear explanation of it, but it's well established experimentally. And the statement is that physics or the world is non-local, and somehow they're tethered together in some entangled way, even though they're not communicating in any way that we know of. This was a very strange finding. I think it was in the 1930s. It's, I guess the first characterization of it was Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox. It's called a paradox. It isn't really a paradox, it's just an observation. But in any case, seemingly relatively exotic and subtle piece of our world that you'd think doesn't really, it's not something you're going to go form companies on. But actually, there's lots of companies that are based on quantum entanglement. There's quite a few. I just picked a few here that are maybe more commercial. These companies, some of them, they do many things, but you can use this entanglement to make remote detection of tampering with encryption keys on messages. If somebody messes around with your key, or by that I mean they read it, if they read the information you're trying to transmit, you can know it in another location because those photons, in this case, are entangled. So it's a way of keeping track of security of information. So that's something that I would say back in the 30s certainly, and even quite recently would seem like not at all likely to be a commercial product, but these are companies with big customers, and it's a accepted area of commercialization. Another piece of physics that seemed like would never be commercialized was Einstein's general theory of relativity, which deals with distortion of space and time by mass. This is something that was never seen as being of practical use outside of warp drives and wormholes and things you see in science fiction. But it turns out that GPS systems need to have very accurate clocks, and the fact that a satellite is in the lower gravity realm by being up in the air than clocks on the Earth, it changes the speed of the clocks due to the gravitational field being a little less. A heavy gravitational field will slow down clocks. So this actually has to be taken into account by the engineers that were designing the GPS systems. So I don't know of any companies based on it, but here's a case where something seemingly very exotic and strange has now been incorporated into engineering of everyday objects that we use all the time, like on our cell phones, cars, and all use GPS constantly, and all of those are adjusted for general relativity. This is just speculative. String theory is an area that's, you've probably heard of it. It's unproven. It's very interesting. It's an intriguing idea where everything's made out of little strings. A lot of controversy about it. May never be worked out so that it really is of value, or it may, but we could imagine, based on what we've seen here before, that maybe in 100 years there'll be string-based products. It's hard to imagine what a string product would be, but crazy as it sounds, maybe that'll actually happen. You can think of a lot of reasons it wouldn't, but that could have applied to some of those other examples too. So this is pitfalls and problems that you run into when you try to commercialize some of these things. Getting technology out of the lab and into the real world is rife with problems. These things can be acknowledged and understood, but they're often underestimated. I think now, after enough time has passed, they're beginning to be recognized as significant, but a major one is the packaging of technology. In the case of these MEMS systems, you can have a very well-working system that's very precise and proven out in the lab, and there it would be on the left-hand side of the picture in this vacuum chamber operating just fine, but that's not going to help you very much if, let's say, it's an oscillator to be used for timing in a cell phone, and you've got to maintain that same vacuum in those same conditions in a little chip inside your pocket that's only a few millimeters across, all packaged up, or maybe less, and you've got to do it for just a few pennies. So it's a major challenge sometimes to take something that's completely developed in the lab and get it out in a packaged way that it can survive in a practical sense. Infrared sensors, for example, on the top there's a couple of, one is an imaging array on the left, and on the right is a power sensor, actually an emitter, I'm sorry. But those have to be packaged up, and there's challenges there. They have to be in vacuums, at least some of them, and they have to be able to have packaging that's transparent in the infrared, so that's an additional aspect. Down below is a MEMS oscillator. That's a comb oscillator. What you see there are those little fingers on the top and the bottom. The central section of that moves back and forth, which would be in the picture there, up and down. And it oscillates at very high frequencies, and these are devices that can potentially replace quartz crystal oscillators in phones and other applications. And they've been shown to have beautiful performance and extremely low cost in the lab in large vacuum chambers like that. But moving that out of that vacuum chamber and into the real world has been not only a packaging challenge, but also there's compensation aspects to it. You compensate for temperature, let's say, or other effects. And those compensations sometimes then have to be compensated for, and it's quite a complex job to take something at looks done, like it's all finished and all the problems are been addressed, and get it out into a small, affordable package. Another series of problems that you run into that are underestimated often are calibration of an instrument or preparation of a sample. Automating the calibration of an instrument before the measurement is taken is often underestimated and overlooked. And similarly, sample preparation, especially in the biological world, of lysing cells or attaching immunological labels or other things you would have to do before running to the sensor, can be trivialized and thought to be easy to do, but in fact, it's something that can be actually the end of a company. I mean, these things that are seemingly mundane and ancillary to the exotic new technology that's been developed oftentimes are really difficult. And the way I put it, it's just easy to overlook the lab tech sitting there. When you go to see these things, and there's a lab tech off to the side kind of getting the demo ready, oftentimes what that lab tech's doing, purifying the cells or maybe calibrating the instrument, are significant problems when you try to say, okay, no more lab tech, now we're out in the field and we're going to have this thing operate by itself. This is a very significant issue. Oftentimes, too, you can see some small handheld detector that's supposed to make some kind of measurement. You put it in your pocket, you take it out and make a measurement. And as a demonstration, they've got a huge laser over on the table powering the thing and making it work. And you can just kind of ask a question about that. Well, what about this? And the answer, well, we'll scale that down later. That's not a problem. But actually, it often is a problem. So there's a lot of these types of examples. These sorts of things, I think the main characteristic is that the inventor or the people who present the technology, honestly and openly, it's not meant to deceive, they believe in what they've done, they see it, they see that it's working, they've spent years and years getting it to work, and now finally they've solved the problems and the thing is reliably producing excellent data that if that could be reproduced out in the field and the performance of the device, it would be wonderful. And so they're now looking to start a company or get investment or hire people to help them. But these problems, these incidental problems like packaging or calibration or sample prep or the fact that the laser's real big or 100 other things, these what I call extraneous issues, are often the big obstacles to going into production, and they're often much harder to solve than actually the work that went into developing the exotic technology in the first place. And many startups fail because of this. So in looking at a startup company or any new technology, you want to understand first what's the proof that the main technology is working, but then you need to immediately really think about, well, so what prevents me from picking that up and walking in the next room and having it work and by myself without knowing anything about it. And when you answer those questions, you usually find out what the real challenges are. It's good to know them up front. And this is just a sort of a laundry list of a few other things. I'll just briefly go through it. But these are mostly non-technical, and they're really significant. Experienced leaders for the companies are really hard to find, people who have the right outlook. These are generally not the technical people. They're people who understand the process of, and I don't, this is not my position, but I've worked with many of these people, and I respect that what they do and how they do it, but I couldn't do it. They're able to have a certain outlook that allows them to steer this company from the early stages on through getting investment and partnerships and so on, and making it successful. And the only way you can really identify them is that they've had a track record in the past of doing this more than once. And those people are hard to find and hard to attract when you do find them. Development's long, markets can change and go away while you're working on it. I've got a dramatic example of that in a minute. Cash flow, just a matter of keeping the money flowing, timing out your investments, not having research work take a little too long, because no matter how good your idea or how valuable, people can only wait so long to get paid. And it's hard to predict this, as I said, predicting and scheduling solutions. It's very hard to plan out what a technical breakthrough is going to take. There's issues, especially in the biomed area, with actual manufacturing. It's not just reimbursement or regulations on the products. There's even regulations on the companies. There's a thing called GMP, which is good manufacturing practices that have to be adopted by the company, and then that's regulated by a group, and it's all a lot of effort. It's important, and it serves a purpose, but it's something you have to take into account. And how are you going to get this thing to market is important. If in some areas there's many people involved, many players in the commercialization chain, and the people taking it to market might be 50 of them, 50 different companies, and it's then hard to take your great new idea and that maybe could revolutionize all this and find out, well, who's going to do that, because none of them have access to the market. You'd like to have only little pieces. You'd like to have a partner who sells to most of the market, so that if you make a relationship and you really demonstrate that you have something, they can actually bring it out there for you. And this list goes on, and the point to it is that technology is very important, it's critical, but it's only a piece of the process. It's a long way from getting you a successful outcome. So now I'll talk about just a few examples. Some of these are things that I experienced, others I know about. This is about I call it the fragility of a startup, or delicacy of it. They're not robust like a big company, and they can't take a lot of problems. This small company that I'm telling about worked on a MEMS detector, so it was done by the MEMS process, and the process is, as I said, complex, it's expensive. To make a MEMS prototype the first ones can take a year, or depending on how far advanced the technology was to begin with. But even once you know all about what the device is and you want to make a new iteration, it has to go through many wafer processes in the semiconductor fab. And so it takes a long time, and the fab uses very toxic chemicals, and there's a lot of safety issues. It's a very regulated place. We have one here at the University of Michigan up on North Campus as part of the electrical engineering department. But these are complex processes. So prototyping takes a long time. And this company had gone through this for some time and had many failures, and the yields weren't good. In other words, they'd run the process and they'd get some parts, but not all of them worked. But eventually they came along where they had one chip that demonstrated very well the fundamental capability that they were trying to sell. And just as difficult as doing that was making a relationship with somebody to look at it, someone who might be a partner. And they had done that too. They had a major company looking at this in a very competitive environment, and they brought their technology forward, which had been patented. The company had been formed. A huge amount of effort had gone into producing this little chip that worked. And the customer was waited through many delays, as finally they said, here it is, we've got the chip. So the stage was finally set to move forward, and then somebody dropped the chip. It made out of silicon, fell on the floor, it broke. This again must have been months of delay. The relationship with the customer was irretrievably set back, investment stopped for the company, and it went out of business. So this story, more than almost any other one, illustrates how delicate these companies can be. Even a tiny event like just dropping something on the floor killed the company, and all the investment was lost and all the people are out of work. And if that hadn't happened, it's possible that the whole thing would have been a success. Nobody knows. But at any rate, it's a clear example of a very small event having profound consequences, because these companies are just sometimes barely hanging on. Here's another example that also, this is kind of something you wouldn't expect. Or as I put it, it's obvious in retrospect, but what's not. A device to monitor soot in diesel engines was developed. It seemed to be that there was a market, and the product was developed, and it made measurement of the concentration of soot in diesel engines, and it could monitor whether the soot agglomerated or not. In other words, at a certain point you use up your anticoagulants in the oils, and at that point the soot particles, which are typically tens of nanometers to maybe 100 nanometers in size, start agglomerating together, and they get to be a micron size or bigger. And at that point they're so big that they're about the size of the oil films that protect the bearings on the journal bearings in a piston engine. And so they start getting driven down into the bearing material, and it causes a lot of damage. I mean, wear it greatly accelerates. So knowing when that's happening is potentially extremely valuable, and changing the oil at the right time, whether it be too early or too late. So this was already, and it was put out and tested and so on. But then it came up somewhere along the line that the engine manufacturers would void the warranties if you didn't rigidly adhere to the recommended oil change intervals. And so, well, all right, your product's great. You want us to take twice as long to change the oil sometimes and half as long another. You just indemnify us that if the engine fails, you'll pay for it. Well, that's not a non-starter for a little company, has no resources, and so no sales came from it, and this was just a dead stop. No one had foreseen it, and again, you know, you can look back and think, oh, that makes sense, but you know, all the things I'm talking about that are problems, they all make sense once you've seen it, but that's what experience is. This was something that no one anticipated, and it was an absolute obstacle. I'm going to talk about this a bit longer story. This is about the company that is the spin-out from the Center for Ultrafast Optical Sciences. This is Professor Moreau's group out there at North Campus, part of the EE department. A company was formed. This is during the time when the telecommunications market was really growing. A company was formed to create optical telecom switching components. This device shown in the upper right is just a complex picture. I'm not going to try to explain what the different pieces are, but it's basically a switching circuit to switch signals as you would do electronically in a phone system, but it's done optically. So you're interleaving signals, so you convolve them together and send them over a line to another site, and then you take the signals apart and send them off on different channels. You can imagine all the complexity of routing optical signals around the world. And so these devices were made using some of Professor Moreau's technology, which were ultra-fast lasers that would deliver about 40 megawatts of power, which is, you know, roughly the amount of power maybe Ann Arbor might draw in the summer with air conditioners, perhaps, in a region a few microns across. So it was extremely high power density, but not a lot of energy because it's a very short period of time. A femtoseconds 10 to the minus 15 seconds. So this was, the timing was measured in tens of femtoseconds. So this would cause a plasma, dissociate all the electrons off all the atoms in the quartz, and then it would be turned off very rapidly before much energy was delivered, and that was critical because that kept the energy density down so there wasn't heat, which would make cracks around the region being treated. If you put too much energy in there, it cracks. Well, you may have seen little blocks of glass. You see them at the airport or gift shops or checkout counters with little pieces of glass, and inside of them are 3D images kind of written in a kind of frosty trace way, where lasers are brought to bear and they make little cracks in the glass, and that's traced around, and they might make a picture of the Eiffel Tower or a car or something, and so you have this little piece of glass with this 3D image in there. You can even go to airports and sit down, and they can take a 3D picture of you sitting in a booth and give you a little piece of glass with a 3D picture. Well, that's related to this, but different in that that is a case where you're breaking the glass, little cracks. In this case, you can't break it, and so that's the key element. And so it's used to create regions where the density of the quartz is a little different, and that changes the index of refraction a little bit, and so that acts as an optical waveguide, so as you would have inside of the core of a piece of optical fiber, the same type of fiber that's used for optical telecommunications. So if you connect one of these fibers to a block of quartz, and in the quartz you're able to move around and write in 3 dimensions optical waveguides, and you can make directional couplers and splitters and interleavers and polarizers and all the other sorts of items that you would normally see on an optical bench, but you can write them all in a very tiny block of quartz. They never get misaligned, then they're very small, and it's inexpensive and robust and so on. A lot of great things. It's a wonderful technology. And so this was a great technology at the right time. Everything was perfect. And then the company was formed in late 2000. And this is a picture of the NASDAQ Composite Index. And there's the company being founded right there, December 2000. And that's the NASDAQ, which is basically the technical index. And so this is practically as soon as it was formed, there was a catastrophic crash in the telecom market as the dot-com bubble burst, and that took with it all the optical telecom companies, and companies all over went out of business. We all know about this. It's kind of a disaster. So this is something that, what can you do? I mean, here's a company with this wonderful technology formed, it targeted exactly at this. It had everything that you would want. Most importantly, it had a very big growing market, so it had the most important target, and it had special technology that was patented, and they had a lock on it, and were able to do it. Everything was perfect, and then this happened. So it's not an example of taking too long to develop technology and having the market wither away while you're doing it, or the market take another direction. It was a catastrophic and unexpected event. So at any rate, so what do you do? So in this case, the technology was redeployed in two ways. The writing of the waveguides did not remove material. It changed the index of refraction. But by changing how it was, the power and some other parameters, and following up with chemical and mechanical treatments, the company was able to remove material where the razor had written. So consequently, you could make devices that were undercut or with three-dimensional freedom. If you look at microfluidics or MEMS or these different processes, everything is more or less planar. And you can make 3D features, but you kind of build them by stacking them up like a deck of cards, sort of. Whereas in this case, you could go into a block of quartz, as seen here on the right. This is a device, it's a biological separations column. The fluid, this is the input channel. This is a sort of a spiral, then it goes through here, spirals again and goes out. And this body here, this is all quartz. And this thing here is about, I think it's like 80 microns or so across. So the whole thing is, hundreds of microns high, maybe, maybe half a millimeter or something. And so this was the customer specified what the diameter should be as a function of the axial position along this channel, and this was created by this process by this company. There's no other way to do this. I mean, you can do stereolithography in plastic and so on, but this is in blocks of quartz, and you can wind up with channels of different shapes. If you'd wanted, you could have taken this channel and made a loop and gone back out, or you could have protrusions sticking into the channel if you wanted, and so on. So it's a very versatile, unique technology, potentially of value. And then the second thing that was developed was treating the surfaces, cutting out and shaping the quartz, and leaving the surfaces very smooth so that the micro and nano cracks that you normally have in glass were either reduced or not present. When glass breaks, it's because there's small cracks all over the surface, so there's stress rising points so that it'll break. And in this case, those were removed so as to give the glass a sort of a mechanical feature, like so it can move and bend like MEMS. I'm going to jump out here for a second. Let's see here. And here's an example of this. This is a piece of glass. That little bending part there is, I think, around 50 microns across, that juncture where it's bending. And normally, if it hadn't been treated, it would break right at that point right there, or very close to that. And yet this has cycled for millions of cycles. This is an actual commercial product that's sold and replaces a piece of metal. And the reason the metal was rejected is it had hysteresis. After some millions of bends, it would not come all the way back. And also, it would work harden and break. And the glass actually is superior to metal in terms of its work hardening and its hysteresis. So seemingly wonderful technology. Okay, so these capabilities were developed. And the idea was to produce instruments such as absorption measurement instruments and spectrometers and flow cytometers and things that are normally great big delicate instruments that are optofluidic generally, or at least optical, and produce them in small blocks of quartz you could hold in your hand that would be permanent and robust and indestructible. So this is a big turn from the telecom application, but this made sense, and markets were sought for these instruments. Now here's one of them. This is a flow cytometer in one piece. A flow cytometer is a device that you send cells through. The cells are usually labeled with immunological labels so that they'll fluoresce if it's the right cell. Using surface adhesion molecules on the cell, you can immunologically target certain cells and not others, so you can label the ones you want and then hit them with the UV light, and if they fluoresce, then you've made a detection of what you wanted, and if they don't, it's not there, hopefully. So this is a flow cytometer. I'm looking at the time. Okay, I'm not going to show the movie with that. This is called a Microstage. This is a sort of a MEMS type device. I don't know if it looks too familiar, but it's similar in some ways to the MEMS resonator I showed earlier. It's a device that oscillates and moves back and forth. And in this case, it's used as part of a spectrometer. There's a device, a technology called Fourier transform spectroscopy, where you, instead of sweeping in the frequency domain, you can sweep in position domain, and you move a mirror in and out against a Michelson interferometer, and you can wind up getting a spectrum of an incoming signal, in this case an infrared signal, so you get an infrared spectrum. But to do that, you need to move a mirror very exactly and in a very controlled way, and so this is a technology that's being pursued by the company to make a Fourier transform infrared spectrometer to be used in laboratories, or possibly in industrial processes, or, well, many places. But unfortunately, the customer has not been uniquely identified yet. It has several characteristics. Here it is in a little package here. If I can get the marker there. This is one of our employees dropping it off the roof and onto cement. It's in a little foam package. And it falls off the roof and hits the cement and doesn't break. So the glass is, if you don't smack it with a hammer, the glass is just almost indestructible. You think of glass as being delicate, but actually, unless you really impinge on it, it's pretty tough stuff. And here's a little picture of the stage. You get an idea of the size next to the penny. In the MEMS world, one thing you see pictures of more than anything else is pennies. I'd say that at the North Campus there in the electrical engineering department, they've produced more pictures of pennies than any other group in the world. But anyway, there's our penny, and here's the device. Not completed yet. You saw this movie before, but this is a way to take this optical momentum transfer to cells and sort cells. So this is a idea to sort out platelets, to make a platelet activity monitor, which can be a valuable thing if someone is in an emergency situation. You want to know about their blood clotting. Potentially this is a value. Unfortunately, it's a little bit of an esoteric measurement, and it might not have value out in the field, but this is something being explored. So there's lots of other things that the company is looking at. Fuel injector nozzles, traps for quantum ions, for quantum computing. You have to hold the ions, and then you entangle them, like I talked about before with entanglement. You need to, if that's to become practical, you'd like to scale that down, so you'd like quantum ion traps, and so doing ion traps, and the list goes on. So there's, as a summary of all this, all wonderful things, interesting things to be working on, but two lessons. One, don't found a company at the end of a bubble. That's hard to do, but good idea. But more realistically, it's a long road when the market's not clearly demanding what you make, or when you don't have a clear fix on the market. That's really the takeaway. And there's not much you can do about it, because the company would have failed immediately, like so many telecom companies did, but it's still working, and maybe we'll have some very valuable result. But since the market wasn't standing there and still isn't saying, we want what you've got, it's a kind of a tough road. Just a few more quick examples. This is a heart surgery company startup. This company was founded back when open heart surgery was first coming about, and the company was closely allied with the leading surgeons, and so there was no, the market was just a little bit ahead of the technology. In other words, it was just a new procedure being developed, and this company then was satisfying the need of that surgery procedure with instruments, and as the technology would move forward, the company would move with it, supplying the products that were needed. And even as the company pushed their technology forward, that would lead to procedures in open heart surgery. So this was a case where there was a nice match, a wonderful match between the market and the company that grew along together. And the second example there, it's a leukocyte reduction filter. This is a company that was founded by people who had a great understanding of the medical filtration market, and so when they formed the company, they knew right from the beginning who the customers were, how to get to them, what they wanted, and all of that. So it was a market-driven company, and they jumped in and grew very rapidly. It was a nice fit right from the beginning. And from the revenue from those sales, then they were able to develop advanced technologies, and this went very successfully. And lastly, this is a company that is based on a new problem that's just come about. It's using new technologies, counterfeit coins can be counterfeited. So in this world of collector coins, which you'd think would be a pretty tiny market, but it's actually reasonably big, a company uses a laser technology to identify counterfeits. And this is actually turns out to be a wonderful match, and this company is rapidly growing. So it's a case where it's kind of a surprising market seems to come out of nowhere of a reasonable size, and it was identified, and then the company's addressing it right now. So the common thread of all this is the same thing I'm saying all along. I'm kind of saying mostly one thing, and that is that the market need is pulling all those products in different ways in each case, but it's pulling them forward. So even though they have a lot of work to do and it's very hard, the most important thing is there. And instead of what often happens, which is pushing technology forward toward an unenthusiastic market that maybe is interested if you talk to them long enough. And so what comes out of this? Almost any area of science or technology has commercialization possibilities. I was trying to show that earlier with the entanglement and general relativity and so on. You just can't tell what may or may not be applicable. I used to be much more skeptical about that when I was younger, thinking, oh, they'll never use this, or how can you do that? But after you look around, it's amazing what actually can be made to work practically. That's been one of the main lessons here for me, is the fact that you just can't tell what won't work. You can just think something isn't going to work, and you keep working on it, and it's surprising how things come along. They're not always. Sometimes they're disasters, but it really can go well. The commercialization process is very diverse, as you can see here, especially for small companies where all sorts of aspects come to bear on you, from the marketing issues and path to market and technology and regulations and reimbursement and all that. And there are many ways to fail, because any one of those things, any one of those 100 things goes wrong and the company's done, can be. In solving problems, it's always good to look at existing technology first rather than developing new technology. If something's out there, like the accelerometers, it might be the ideal, simple, and inexpensive solution to some complex problem. It's just a matter of putting them together. And lastly, once again, you got to find a market. So my concluding slide is you have to work hard on these startups, and people talk about giving their blood to their company, but here I am having a unit of the blood drawn out of me to test some of our leukocyte reduction filters. So it's me and my colleagues. We take turns giving our blood and testing these things, and kept hoping, well, I hope they're done soon, because we're tired of this. So that's it. That's my talk.
Saturday Morning Physics is sponsored by the M. Lois Tiffany Endowment, the Hideko Tomazawa Endowment, the Physics Department, and by gifts from friends of the program.